I still remember the exact second the room went silent. My Uncle Richard was laughing. Not the kind of laugh people use when something is genuinely funny. It was the sharp, smug laugh of a man who had spent his entire life believing money made him better than everyone else. Victoria could have married a surgeon, he announced, raising his wine glass high enough for every relative in the room to hear, or a successful attorney. Instead, she married a mechanic. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My husband Mason kept his expression calm. That only encouraged Richard. Then my uncle reached out and grabbed Mason's arm. "Tell me, son, do you at least fix expensive boats?" The sleeve of Mason's shirt pulled back. A faded tattoo appeared. Just 4 letters and 2 numbers. Ghost 11. Richard laughed again. But before anyone else could react, my 82-year-old grandfather shoved back his chair so hard it nearly toppled over. The sound echoed through the dining room. Every head turned. The retired 4-star general stared at the tattoo as if he had just seen a ghost. Then he pointed directly at my uncle. "Richard," he said in a voice I hadn't heard since childhood, "you will apologize to that man. Right now." My uncle's smile disappeared. And for the first time in his life, Richard Bennett looked afraid. "My name is Victoria Reed, and if you had met my family before that night, you probably would have assumed we had everything figured out." The Reed family had money, military history, and enough pride to fill an aircraft carrier. My grandfather, General William Reed, was the foundation of that reputation. His framed photographs lined the walls of the family estate in Northern Virginia. There were pictures of him standing beside presidents, military leaders, and foreign dignitaries. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday, and family reunion eventually turned into someone telling one of Grandpa's stories. Most of us admired him. Some of us tried to impress him. And one person spent his entire life competing for his approval. My Uncle Richard. Richard was my mother's older brother, and one of those men who measured human worth with a calculator. If someone drove a luxury vehicle, Richard respected them. If someone owned multiple properties, Richard admired them. If someone worked with their hands, Richard dismissed them. Simple as that. Growing up, I learned very quickly that Richard viewed life as a hierarchy. At the top were wealthy executives. Below them were doctors and lawyers. Below them were everyone else. The irony was that Grandpa never thought that way. He respected discipline, sacrifice, and integrity. Richard respected net worth. Those two philosophies had been quietly fighting each other for decades. I became aware of it long before I met Mason. As a teenager, I watched Richard boast about business deals, while Grandpa spent hours talking with veterans, firefighters, and teachers. Grandpa always listened. Richard always judged. The conflict remained hidden beneath polite smiles for years. Then I met the man who would become my husband. Mason Reed wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. He wasn't particularly interested in drawing attention to himself. The first thing I noticed about him was how comfortable he seemed in silence. Most people try to impress you when they first meet you. Mason didn't. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened carefully. And when he spoke, his words actually meant something. At the time, I was serving as an Army officer and stationed near Norfolk. Mason worked at a maritime repair facility along the coast. His hands carried small scars from years of physical work. His truck was 10 years old. His apartment was modest. And somehow I trusted him more than people who wore $1,000 suits. The deeper I got to know him, the more obvious it became. He was the kind of man who returned shopping carts. The kind who stopped to help strangers change flat tires. The kind who quietly paid for a veteran's meal without telling anyone. When we started dating, Richard immediately disapproved. I still remember the first dinner. Richard looked Mason up and down before asking what he did for a living. "Mason works in marine systems maintenance," I answered. Richard smiled. "Not kindly?" "Oh," he said, "so he's a mechanic." The word sounded like an insult coming from him. Mason simply nodded. "Something like that." Richard spent the rest of the evening talking about investment portfolios. Mason spent the evening helping my grandmother carry dishes into the kitchen. Guess which one earned Grandpa's respect? Unfortunately, Richard never noticed. As our relationship grew more serious, his criticism became less subtle. "Victoria," he told me one afternoon, "you're a Reed. You have options." I knew exactly what he meant. "You think I'm making a mistake?" "I think you're settling." Those words stayed with me. Not because I believed them, because I couldn't understand how someone could be so blind. Mason never tried to prove himself, never argued, never bragged, never defended his pride. If Richard made a rude comment, Mason let it pass. If someone underestimated him, he smiled politely. Sometimes that frustrated me. I wanted him to push back. I wanted him to stand up for himself. Instead, he'd squeeze my hand and quietly change the subject. One evening after another unpleasant family gathering, I finally asked him why. Why do you let him talk to you like that? Mason stared out at the Chesapeake Bay for several moments before answering. Because people usually reveal more about themselves than they do about you. I remember looking at him and thinking there was a story behind those words. A very big story. But he never explained. And I never pushed. Over the years, Richard's opinion never changed. When we got engaged, he criticized the ring. When we bought our first house, he criticized the neighborhood. When Mason started his own repair business, Richard criticized the size of the company. Nothing was ever enough. The strange thing was that Grandpa always seemed amused by it. He'd watch Richard boast and then quietly ask Mason about work. The conversations often lasted an hour, sometimes longer. I noticed Grandpa studying him occasionally, as if he sensed something nobody else could see. I didn't understand it then. I would soon. Because Grandpa's 82nd birthday was approaching, the entire family would gather at the estate. Dozens of relatives, friends, military colleagues, business associates, everyone. The event had been planned for months. Richard was especially excited. His daughter had recently received a major promotion at a financial firm, and he clearly intended to spend the evening talking about it. As the date approached, I found myself feeling uneasy. Not nervous exactly, just aware. Family gatherings always followed the same pattern. Richard would drink. Richard would brag. Eventually, Richard would target someone. And somehow that someone always seemed to be Mason. The morning of Grandpa's birthday arrived bright and clear. As Mason and I drove toward the estate, sunlight filtered through the trees lining the long private road. I looked over at him. You know Uncle Richard is going to say something tonight. Mason smiled without taking his eyes off the road. Probably. And you're okay with that? Victoria, he said gently, some battles aren't worth fighting. I nodded. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. For years, my husband had quietly endured every insult. For years, Richard had mistaken kindness for weakness. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I had a feeling that before the night was over, someone was about to learn how wrong they had been. By the time Mason and I arrived at the Reed estate, the place already looked like something out of a magazine. Luxury sedans lined the circular driveway. Valets moved between vehicles. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers on the patio. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished hardwood floors that had witnessed generations of Reed family gatherings. For most guests, it was a celebration. For me, it felt more like waiting for a storm. I greeted cousins, aunts, uncles, retired officers, and longtime family friends. Everyone wanted to see Grandpa. At 82, he still carried himself with remarkable presence. His hair had turned completely white years ago, but his posture remained straight, and his eyes still held the sharp focus of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. From across the room, I spotted him speaking with two retired colonels. Then he noticed Mason. A smile immediately crossed his face. There he is, Grandpa said. The colonels turned. Grandpa motioned Mason over. For nearly 20 minutes, the three men talked while I chatted with relatives nearby. As usual, Mason never dominated the conversation. He mostly listened, asked questions, occasionally smiled. Yet somehow people always seemed drawn to him. I noticed one of the colonels laughing at something Mason said. Another nodded thoughtfully. Whatever my husband was discussing, he had their full attention. Meanwhile, Richard was working a different room entirely. My uncle moved through the crowd like a politician during campaign season. Every conversation somehow returned to him. His investments, his properties, his business ventures, his daughter's promotion, his success. I watched him place a hand on a guest's shoulder. You know what separates successful people from everyone else? Richard asked. The guest smiled politely. What? Standards. I nearly rolled my eyes. That word again. Standards. It was Richard's favorite way of disguising arrogance as wisdom. As evening approached, everyone moved into the formal dining room. The long table stretched nearly the entire length of the room. Elegant place settings gleamed beneath chandelier light. Servers brought course after course while conversations flowed naturally around the table. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. Grandpa shared stories from his military career. Family members laughed. People toasted his health. Even Richard behaved himself, at least initially. But years of experience had taught me that Richard became more difficult after wine. The first glass made him louder. The second made him boastful. The third usually made him dangerous. Halfway through dinner, I noticed him finishing that third glass. My stomach tightened. Across from me, Mason remained relaxed. Completely relaxed. He cut his steak, listened to conversation, and occasionally smiled. I honestly envied his ability to stay calm. Then Richard cleared his throat. The sound immediately drew attention. Speaking of achievements, he said, raising his glass, I'd like to congratulate my daughter Emily on her recent promotion. Everyone applauded politely. Emily smiled awkwardly. To her credit, she never enjoyed being used as one of Richard's trophies. She was actually a decent person. Vice president before 40, Richard continued proudly. Not bad. More polite applause followed. Grandpa nodded. Congratulations, Emily. Thank you, Grandpa. For a moment I thought the subject would end there. I should have known better. Richard took another sip. Then his eyes shifted toward me. And then toward Mason. The change was subtle, but I saw it immediately. The predator had chosen a target. You know, Richard said loudly, Victoria was always one of the brightest members of this family. A few relatives nodded. I felt the trap forming. Outstanding student, military officer, leadership potential. He smiled. Then came the knife. It's just surprising where life takes people. Silence spread slowly around the table. Not complete silence. Just enough. Enough for everyone to recognize what was happening. I set down my fork. Richard, my mother, warned. He ignored her. Honestly, when Victoria was younger, I expected she'd marry someone extraordinary. I felt heat rising in my chest. Across from me, Mason remained perfectly composed. I did marry someone extraordinary, I said. Richard laughed. A few people stared down at their plates. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Come on, Richard said, don't be sensitive. Sensitive? That was always the word people used after saying something cruel. I'm just being honest. Grandpa's expression hardened slightly. Richard either didn't notice or didn't care. I mean, look around this table. He gestured broadly. We have executives, attorneys, military leaders, entrepreneurs. Then he looked directly at Mason. And we have a mechanic. The word landed heavily, like he'd been saving it all evening. Nobody spoke. Emily looked horrified. My mother closed her eyes briefly. I could practically hear people wishing they were somewhere else. Mason owns his own company, I said sharply. A small repair business, Richard replied. Mason gently touched my hand beneath the table. A silent request. Let it go. Normally, I would have listened. Tonight felt different. Why does that bother you so much, I asked. Richard shrugged. It doesn't bother me. Then why bring it up? He smiled. That smile. The one I had hated since childhood. Because family should tell the truth. The room grew even quieter. I glanced toward Grandpa. His face had become unreadable. Years in military leadership had given him the ability to conceal emotion when necessary. Unfortunately for Richard, I knew that expression. It meant he was paying very close attention. Richard leaned back in his chair. You had every opportunity in the world, Victoria. There it was. The sentence he had been building toward for years. You married beneath yourself. The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the servers froze. I looked at Mason. Part of me expected anger, embarrassment, anything. Instead, he simply sighed. A small, tired sigh. Not because he was hurt. Because he was disappointed. That somehow made it worse. Richard, Grandpa said quietly. It was a warning. A clear one. Any reasonable person would have stopped. Richard wasn't reasonable. Not when his ego was involved. Tell me something, Mason. My husband looked up calmly. Yes, sir. Have you ever sat at a table with generals before? The insult was obvious. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Mason considered the question. Then he answered. Yes. Richard laughed immediately. A loud mocking laugh. Sure you have. A few people stared at Mason curiously. Something about his answer seemed oddly confident. Not defensive. Not sarcastic. Just factual. Richard shook his head. Victoria could have married anyone. Then he spoke the sentence that would change the entire evening. She married far beneath her level. My pulse pounded. Before I could respond, Richard pushed back his chair. He walked around the table toward Mason. The gesture alone was aggressive. Several relatives watched nervously. Richard stopped beside him. Don't take it personally, he said. Then he placed a hand on Mason's arm. The move looked almost friendly, until he tightened his grip. Maybe one day you'll move up in the world. Mason slowly stood. Not threatening. Not confrontational, simply standing. But as Richard held his arm, the cuff of Mason's dress shirt shifted upward. Just a few inches. Enough. A faded tattoo became visible near his forearm. Dark letters. Old ink. The kind left by experiences most people never understand. Richard glanced down. What's this? The tattoo was simple. Just one designation. Ghost 11. Richard frowned. Some biker gang. A few people chuckled uncertainly. Then the room erupted with the sound of a chair scraping violently across hardwood. Everyone turned. Grandpa was standing. His face had gone pale. His eyes were locked on the tattoo. Locked on Mason. And for the first time all evening, the retired general looked genuinely shocked. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt unnatural, heavy. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people instinctively realize something important has just happened, even if they don't yet understand what it is. Grandpa remained standing. His chair sat crooked behind him. His eyes never left Mason. Not once. The entire dining room seemed frozen in place. Richard was still gripping Mason's arm. His expression had shifted from smug amusement to confusion. What, he asked? Why is everyone staring? No one answered. I looked at Grandpa. In all my years I had seen him angry. I had seen him disappointed. I had seen him emotional exactly twice. I had never seen him look shocked. Until now, Mason, Grandpa said quietly. The room became even stiller. Yes, sir, Mason replied. Where did you get that tattoo? Mason glanced down at his forearm. For the briefest moment, something passed across his face. Not fear. Not regret. Recognition. Like a door opening to a room he rarely visited anymore. Then he looked back at Grandpa. During my service. Grandpa swallowed. His jaw tightened. Were you part of Ghost 11? Mason didn't answer immediately. That hesitation alone made my heart begin to race. I suddenly realized there were entire sections of my husband's life I knew almost nothing about. I'd always assumed it was because he was private. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. Finally he nodded. Yes, sir. A collective murmur moved through the room. Not because anyone understood what Ghost 11 meant. Most of them didn't. They were reacting to Grandpa, to the way he looked at Mason, to the weight behind the question. Richard laughed awkwardly. Okay, somebody needs to explain this. Nobody joined him. The laugh died quickly. Ghost what? Richard continued. A military club. Enough. The word struck the room like a hammer. Everyone turned. Grandpa's voice had become sharp, commanding. For a split second, he sounded less like an 82-year-old retiree and more like the 4-star general he once was. Richard blinked. Dad, I said enough. The interruption landed harder than any shout. Because Grandpa almost never interrupted people, especially family, especially publicly. Richard's face reddened. The room grew tense. Then Grandpa slowly walked around the table. Every eye followed him. He stopped directly in front of Mason. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then something remarkable happened. Grandpa extended his hand. Not casually. Not socially. Respectfully. Deeply respectfully. The way one professional might greet another. The way one warrior might acknowledge someone who had endured the same burdens. Mason, Grandpa said quietly, It's an honor to finally meet you properly. Gasps echoed around the room. I stared. So did everyone else. Even Mason looked slightly uncomfortable. Sir, that's not necessary. Yes, Grandpa replied, it is. The room exploded into whispered conversations. People looked back and forth between the two men, trying desperately to understand what they were witnessing. Richard folded his arms. This is ridiculous. Grandpa turned. The look he gave his son immediately silenced him. Then Grandpa addressed the room. You all deserve some context. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Many years ago, Grandpa began certain military operations officially did not exist. The room remained silent. Some units were never discussed publicly. Their missions were classified. Their successes were classified. Their failures were classified. He looked toward Mason. Ghost 11 was one of those units. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Grandpa continued. They operated where conventional forces couldn't. His voice remained calm, measured. They rescued hostages. They extracted intelligence assets. They conducted operations most Americans will never hear about. A retired colonel at the far end of the table slowly nodded. He clearly understood more than most. Selection rates were extremely low, Grandpa continued. Attrition rates were high. Nobody missed what he meant. People got hurt. People died. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Okay, he said. So he was military. That's admirable. Lots of people serve. The room remained quiet. Even Richard seemed to realize his words weren't landing the way he expected. Grandpa stared at him, then turned back to Mason. What years? Mason answered. The moment he finished, Grandpa's eyes widened again. You were active during Black Ridge. My breath caught. The name meant nothing to me. But apparently it meant something to Grandpa. A great deal. Mason was silent. Then he nodded once. Yes, sir. Grandpa slowly sat down. Not because he was tired, because the revelation genuinely affected him. I had never seen anything like it. "Dear God," he whispered. Richard frowned. "What is Black Ridge?" No one answered immediately. Finally, Grandpa spoke. "An operation that saved American lives." The room remained focused on him. "It happened overseas. Official details were never released." His eyes returned to Mason. "There were men on that mission who never came home." Mason looked down briefly. The movement was small, but I noticed it. So did Grandpa. A long silence followed. The kind born from memory, not discomfort. Memory. Then Grandpa spoke again. "How many?" Mason took a breath. "7. No further explanation. None needed." The room seemed to shrink. I suddenly understood something. Mason wasn't avoiding attention because he was shy. He was avoiding attention because he carried things most people couldn't imagine. Things that didn't fit comfortably into casual dinner conversations. Grandpa nodded slowly. His expression had softened. "You lost friends." "Yes, sir." The answer was quiet. Almost too quiet. But every person in the room heard it. I felt a knot forming in my chest. Because I recognized that tone. I'd heard it before from veterans. People who had survived experiences they wished others never would. For the first time all evening, Richard looked uncertain. The confidence that had fueled him for years was beginning to disappear. "You never told anyone?" Grandpa asked. Mason shook his head. "No reason to. No reason to." The words landed harder than any speech could have. Richard spent every family gathering advertising his accomplishments. Meanwhile, the man he'd spent years mocking had apparently spent years hiding achievements that would leave entire rooms speechless. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. A retired Navy officer finally spoke from across the table. "You served in Ghost 11 and became a mechanic." Mason smiled faintly. "I became a husband." The simplicity of the answer stunned me. Several people laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was genuine. Because it revealed exactly who Mason was. The officer nodded. "Fair point." Grandpa leaned back slowly. For the first time that evening, his eyes glistened slightly. Not with sadness. With pride. "Your generation carried burdens most Americans never saw," he said. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them felt like mutual understanding. Something earned. Something impossible to fake. Then Grandpa turned his head toward Richard. The movement was slow, deliberate, dangerous. And suddenly I knew exactly what was coming. Because Richard had spent years judging a man whose story he never bothered to learn. Years measuring him by income, by occupation, by appearances. And now the truth was standing directly in front of him. The realization hit my uncle one painful piece at a time. I watched it happen. The confusion, the doubt, the embarrassment, the dawning awareness that the man he had publicly humiliated might not merely be respectable. He might be one of the most extraordinary people in the room. The atmosphere in the dining room had completely changed. An hour earlier, people had been discussing investments, vacation homes, promotions, and retirement plans. Now nobody seemed interested in any of those things. Every conversation revolved around one person. Mason. Ironically, he looked like the only person in the room who wished the attention would disappear. He remained standing for another moment before quietly taking his seat. Several relatives stared at him with open curiosity. Others looked almost embarrassed. Not because of anything Mason had done. Because they were replaying years of assumptions inside their own heads. Years of judging him the same way Richard had. Grandpa finally broke the silence. "Mason, would you sit beside me?" The request surprised everyone, including Mason. Grandpa's seat sat at the head of the table, a position that had always carried symbolic importance within our family. Normally that space beside him was reserved for senior relatives or distinguished guests. Without argument, Mason stood and moved to the empty chair. Richard watched the entire thing happen. His jaw tightened. I knew exactly what he was feeling. For decades, he had fought for Grandpa's admiration, and now he was watching another man receive it effortlessly. Not through wealth, not through status, not through influence, through character. As soon as Mason sat down, questions began emerging from around the table. Some cautious, some direct. "What exactly did your unit do? Were you deployed often? Did your family know?" Mason answered politely but carefully. "Never dramatic, never detailed, never boastful." His responses somehow revealed less than people wanted while still remaining respectful. It became obvious that years of operational secrecy had become second nature. Then one of Grandpa's retired military friends leaned forward. "I apologize if this is too personal," he said, But were you awarded any commendations? The room quieted again. Mason looked uncomfortable. Actually uncomfortable. That alone told me more than any answer could have. Before he could respond, Grandpa spoke. Yes. Everyone turned toward him. Grandpa's eyes remained on Mason. Yes, he was. How do you know, someone asked? Grandpa gave a small smile. Because I recognize certain details. He paused. And because there aren't many people from that era who would carry that designation. Richard shifted in his chair, clearly wishing the conversation would move elsewhere. It didn't. A retired Navy commander at the opposite end of the table nodded thoughtfully. I had a friend in special operations years ago. He glanced toward Mason. He once told me the most impressive people he'd ever met were usually the quietest. Several people smiled. Mason looked down at his glass. Your friend sounds smarter than most people. Laughter moved through the room. Gentle laughter. Warm laughter. The kind Richard had spent the evening trying unsuccessfully to create. For the first time all night, people weren't laughing at someone. They were laughing with someone. And that someone was Mason. I noticed Emily watching her father. Her expression carried disappointment. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind a grown daughter feels when she realizes her parent has become the smallest person in the room. Meanwhile, Grandpa continued asking occasional questions. Not invasive ones. Respectful ones. Questions only another military professional would understand. The more they spoke, the clearer the picture became. Mason had served honorably, extensively, and quietly. He had survived experiences that permanently changed people. Yet he had never used those experiences to elevate himself. That fact seemed to impress Grandpa more than anything else. Eventually, someone asked the question that had been hanging over the entire evening. Why leave that life behind? The room fell silent. Mason thought about the answer. For several seconds. Long enough to make everyone listen. Then he spoke. Because eventually you realize life isn't measured by missions. Nobody interrupted. It's measured by who comes home to you. I felt my throat tighten. Mason glanced toward me. Only briefly. But the meaning was unmistakable. The room grew very still. Several relatives looked away. Others smiled softly. Grandpa nodded, as if hearing confirmation of something he had suspected all along. Then the old general slowly rose from his chair. Everyone immediately became quiet. When William Reed stood up, people listened. Decades of leadership had made that a habit. He rested one hand against the table. His gaze moved across the room, stopping occasionally on family members, friends, guests, then finally on Mason. There are many successful people in this family. The statement hung in the air. Doctors, executives, business owners, military officers. Several people nodded. Grandpa continued. And I am proud of all of them. His voice remained calm, steady, but success can create a dangerous illusion. Nobody moved. It can convince us that titles matter more than integrity. His eyes shifted toward Richard. Only briefly, but everyone noticed. It can convince us that wealth reflects character. The room remained silent. It can convince us that someone's profession tells us their value. Nobody missed the message. Not anymore. Grandpa turned toward Mason. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. This man has done more for his country than most people in this room will ever know. A heavy silence followed. Not because anyone doubted the statement, because they believed it. Completely. Grandpa wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't being sentimental. He was stating a fact, and everyone understood it. I glanced toward Richard. His face had become pale. Not dramatically, subtly. Like a man realizing every decision he made during the evening had been the wrong one. The retired colonel sitting nearby folded his hands. You judged him without knowing him. The observation wasn't directed at anyone specifically, but everyone knew who it was for. Nobody defended Richard. Not one person. Because there was nothing left to defend. For years he had measured Mason by occupation. Now the entire room understood how shallow that measurement had been. Then Emily quietly spoke. Dad! Richard looked toward her. The disappointment in her eyes seemed to hit harder than anything else. She didn't continue. She didn't need to. Sometimes one word is enough, especially when it comes from your child. The room remained silent, the pressure building steadily, relentlessly. Grandpa finally turned completely toward Richard. No anger, no shouting, no theatrics. That somehow made it worse, because disappointment from a respected man often cuts deeper than anger. You spent years criticizing him. Richard looked down. You mocked him tonight. No response. You embarrassed your niece. Still nothing. Then came the final blow. The sentence that landed harder than any insult ever could. You spent so much time looking down on him that you never bothered to see him. The room froze. Richard stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, he had no comeback. No speech. No joke. No defense. Because every person present had witnessed exactly what Grandpa described. Years of arrogance exposed in a single evening. And standing at the center of it all was Mason, the man who had never once tried to prove his worth. The man who never demanded respect. The man who had earned it anyway. Then Grandpa's expression hardened. Just slightly. Enough, Richard, he said quietly. My uncle looked up, and everyone in the room knew the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire dining room seemed suspended in time as Grandpa looked directly at Richard. I had seen powerful men sit across from my grandfather before. Senators, generals, CEOs, foreign officials. Most of them eventually looked away first. That night my uncle did too. His gaze dropped to the table. The silence stretched. Uncomfortable. Unforgiving. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Richard. My uncle swallowed. Yes, Dad. Apologize. The single word landed like a judge's gavel. Richard blinked. For a moment he looked almost stunned, as though he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. Perhaps because for most of his life he had been the one passing judgment on others. Now judgment had found him instead. Dad, he began. Grandpa's expression never changed. Apologize. The room remained silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system, the distant clink of silverware being cleared somewhere beyond the dining room. Even those tiny sounds seemed unusually loud. Richard shifted in his chair. His face had turned red. Part embarrassment, part pride. And pride was clearly losing the battle. For years he had built an identity around being the most successful person in the room. Now he was being forced to acknowledge that success and character weren't the same thing. His eyes moved toward Mason, then away, then back again. I may have, Richard began. Grandpa interrupted immediately. No, the word was sharp. You will not give him a corporate apology. A few relatives looked down to hide their reactions. Grandpa continued. You will not say you're sorry if he was offended. Another pause. You will apologize for what you did. The distinction hit everyone, especially Richard. For the first time that evening, my uncle looked old. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying the weight of choices he could no longer defend. Several seconds passed. Then he slowly stood. The room watched. No one looked away. Not even Emily. Richard cleared his throat. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I was wrong. The words seemed difficult for him. Painfully difficult. He looked directly at Mason. I judged you. Silence. I assumed things about you because of your job. Another pause. I spoke disrespectfully. His jaw tightened. I embarrassed you in front of your family. The room remained still. Richard took a breath, then finally said the thing everyone needed to hear. I'm sorry, Mason. No excuses, no qualifications. Just the apology. For a moment nobody spoke, then all eyes turned toward Mason. How would he respond? Would he confront Richard? Would he remind everyone of years of insults? Would he finally release all the frustration he had carried? I honestly didn't know. Even after years of marriage, there were parts of Mason that remained quietly hidden beneath the surface. He looked at Richard for several seconds, long enough to make everyone wonder. Then he stood. The room became even quieter. I accept your apology. Simple. Direct. Gracious. Exactly what I should have expected from him. Relief visibly passed through several people around the table. But Mason wasn't finished. He looked at Richard calmly. Not angrily. Not triumphantly. Calmly. I don't need anyone to admire me. The room listened. I don't need recognition. His voice remained steady. I don't need people to know what I did 20 years ago. Several guests nodded. Because by now everyone believed him. Completely. Mason wasn't pretending to be humble. He genuinely was. Then he continued. But I hope you'll stop measuring people by titles. Richard looked down. Mason went on. Some of the strongest people I've ever met worked jobs that others overlooked. Nobody interrupted. Some of the most honorable people I've known never became rich. His eyes briefly moved around the room. Some heroes never wear uniforms. The silence that followed felt different from earlier. Not tense. Reflective. People weren't waiting for conflict anymore. They were thinking. Thinking about neighbors, teachers, mechanics, nurses, parents, veterans, ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens. People like Mason. Grandpa slowly nodded. A faint smile appeared on his face. The expression carried immense satisfaction. Not because Richard had been humiliated, because a lesson had finally been learned, or at least begun. Dinner eventually resumed. The atmosphere remained quieter than before, more thoughtful. People spoke differently, listened differently. Several relatives approached Mason throughout the evening, not to praise him, to thank him. Others simply wanted to shake his hand. One elderly veteran embraced him without saying a word. No explanation was necessary. Some experiences create a language of their own. Late in the evening, guests gradually began leaving. Cars disappeared down the long driveway. The house grew calmer, quieter. Eventually, only close family remained. I stepped outside onto the rear terrace for some fresh air. The Virginia night was cool. Crickets chirped beyond the gardens. Soft lights illuminated the stone pathways leading toward the trees. A few minutes later, Mason joined me. We stood together in comfortable silence, the kind we had always shared. "You okay?" I asked. He smiled. "Sure, you handled that better than I would have." A small laugh escaped him. "That wouldn't be difficult." I leaned against his shoulder. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the terrace door opened again. Grandpa stepped outside. His movements were slower than they once had been, but his presence remained undeniable. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," I said. He stood beside us, looking out across the property he had spent decades building. For a while, nobody said anything. Then Grandpa spoke. "You know something I learned after 40 years in uniform?" Mason glanced toward him. "What, sir?" The old general smiled. "The strongest people rarely feel the need to prove they're strong." The words hung in the cool night air. Simple, true, timeless. Mason nodded. Grandpa looked at him for another moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. A gesture of respect. One soldier to another. One man to another. No speeches were necessary. No medals. No recognition. Just respect honestly earned. Eventually, Mason and I walked back toward our truck. As we reached the driveway, I glanced over my shoulder. Through the dining room window, I could see Richard standing alone. The room around him was nearly empty now. The celebration was over. The boasting was over. The performance was over. For the first time in years, he appeared to be thinking. Really thinking. Perhaps about the cost of arrogance. Perhaps about all the people he had misjudged. Perhaps about the difference between success and worth. I don't know. What I do know is this. Money can buy comfort. Titles can create status. But neither can purchase honor. Honor is earned. Quietly. Consistently. One choice at a time. And sometimes the people who deserve the most respect are the very ones who never ask for it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment and think about someone in your own life who may have been underestimated. Maybe it's a neighbor, a coworker, a parent, a veteran, or someone whose value isn't obvious at first glance. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We have many more powerful stories to share, so subscribe and join us for the next journey. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.